So their friend, their teacher, has just been brutally murdered, hung on a cross, ridiculed, shamed, and killed. And to make matters worse, it's not just that they've lost a friend. They've lost a teacher. They've lost a man who they thought was leading them in something real. Sure, it's important to change your hearts and to lead a revolution of the soul. But they said Jesus is the Messiah, and the Messiah is one who liberates. So the apostles, the disciples, were probably expecting Jesus to liberate them in a real way, to free them from the oppression of the Roman government. But yet that very government, that very regime, brutally killed their friend, their teacher, their leader. So they were probably scared. They don't know what this means. They're definitely grieving the loss of that person in their lives, the loss of the purpose. Remember, they left their entire lives to go follow this guy. They left their fishing boats and their nets to go follow Jesus. They're grieving the loss of all of that. They're clearly scared. We know they end up in a locked room, worried about what to do. And on top of all of that, they've added a layer of guilt, of shame. Because when Jesus was dying on the cross, where were the disciples? We know there was one nearby. Other than that, we don't hear of them. They are hiding. They are gone. They are running away. They are distancing themselves. Peter, he stays kind of close, but he distinctly says, I don't know Jesus. I'm not his follower. Right? He denies Jesus. So now they have fear. They have grief. They have anxiety, they have pain, and they've added to all of that shame and guilt. But then Easter, they find an empty tomb. Jesus appears to them not once but twice, miraculously in a locked room, as a sign that maybe they'll get back to that mission. Maybe they'll once again get to walk with their friend and lead towards a new revolution, a new life, a new way of being. There's probably a lot of hope. And those visits from Jesus, the resurrected Jesus, they must have been exhilarating. Not only was their dead friend, who they know was not just killed, but killed quite brutally, not only was he all of a sudden there, but we're told he breathes the Holy Spirit upon them. He says, "Peace be with you." He tells them, I'm going to send you out to forgive sins. He shows them his wounds. So what do the disciples do? Do they take this energy, this vigor, and say, yes, now we'll go out into the world. We will preach the good news. We will heal people. We will cast out demons. We will carry on this revolution. Nope, they go fishing. They go back to the life that they left. They go backward to the time in their life years ago. It must have seemed like a different life altogether, where sure, things were hard, but they were simpler. All they had to worry about every day is feeding themselves and feeding their family. Fishermen. And it's a curious decision. You think about it and you think it doesn't make any sense. Not only did they live a seeming lifetime with this man, Jesus, where they saw him perform miracles. They saw him heal people. They sat with him as he preached and taught people inspirational messages. But then he died and came back to life. Yet they go backwards. They don't carry on forward with that mission, that goal. They go backwards. It's a curious decision until you start to think about, how do we react when we are faced with tragedy? When we're faced with little tragedies, like getting in an argument with someone important to us, or feeling like we've lost a friend because we can't be with that person anymore. Or bigger personal tragedies. Maybe we actually lose a loved one or a friend. Maybe we lose a job. Maybe we lose the opportunity for advancement because we get passed over for something, right? How do we deal with tragedies? So often we run back to what is familiar. We don't think, okay, this terrible thing happened, what's the next thing I should do? We go, we seek comfort, right? Maybe it's societal tragedies. Maybe you look at the news today and you see all the stuff that's happening and you feel heartbroken. And so instead of moving forward, instead of thinking, what is the next thing I can do, you go back to the echo chambers that tell you all of the things you want to hear about how wrong everything is and exactly who we can blame for it. Maybe you just tune out altogether. You're numb by scrolling social media. If you're like me, which I think this is the best one of the vices to run away, I organize things. When I get anxious, the whole kitchen gets reorganized, right? But before you think it's altruistic, I'm doing it like, I can't believe all the stuff is in the wrong place. This shouldn't be here. Everything's changing because I'm seeking control. What I'm doing is at best standing still, at worst actually moving backwards. What did the disciples do? They go back to fishing. Or at least they try, right? Because we're told they fish all night long and catch not a thing. These career fishermen who've probably been fishing since they were old enough to pick up a net, every single day of their lives, fish all night and catch nothing. That is, until a stranger arrives on the beach at the break of dawn and calls to them. And now these are grown men, but he says, "Children, have you no fish?" And he tells them, "Try it again, but in a little bit of a different way." And they listen, and they catch a miraculous number of fish, so many that they can hardly get the nets in the boat. Sound familiar? Yeah, we've heard this story before, but not in the Gospel of John where it happens today. We've heard it in Luke, and it's in a different part of the timeline. The last time we heard about the disciples fishing, the disciples weren't disciples yet. It was a skeptical Peter who had met Jesus, but not really sure what to think about him yet. Jesus gets into their boat, right? In both stories, Jesus is with them while they fish. In both stories, they catch nothing all night long. In both stories, Jesus says, "Try again, but do something a little bit different." And in both stories, the fish that are caught are not just a few, and not just many, but so many. The gospel writers try to describe this to us with sinking boats and nets that are breaking or should have broken, right? And I think most importantly for these stories, in both of these stories, Jesus calls them to do the next thing. Now in Luke, he calls them to follow. He says, "Come, follow me." While they are fishermen, he calls them to go fish for people. Gather the people and bring them to Jesus so they can hear Jesus' words. But now in John, this is a new call, a call to a new sort of discipleship. One where Jesus is not in the boat with them anymore, but calling distantly from the shore, and they're not even quite sure who he is. One where Jesus cannot walk with them in this call. One where they're not being called out of a mundane life that is hard but simple towards seeking this big truth, but they're being called to pick up the shattered pieces of their life, called out of their tragedy, called away from their shame and guilt to move forward. Jesus asks Peter 3 times, "Peter, do you love me?" And it's important that it's 3 because Peter denied Jesus 3 times. So the gospel writer is making it abundantly clear that Jesus has forgiven Peter without even being asked. Peter is ready to go in terms of Jesus. Peter just has to accept that. So 3 times Peter says, a little bit more exasperated each time, "Yes, of course, I love you. Why do you keep asking me this?" And 3 times the call from Jesus is to be a shepherd. Jesus is not calling Peter and the other disciples to bring people to Jesus. He is calling them to be Jesus for one another, for the world. You know, a lot of scholars think that the story we read today was added to John. sometime after the gospel was written. Because the chapter that we read before that Roger preached on with Thomas, right? It ends really succinctly. It says something like, "And Jesus did many other signs while he was with his disciples, so they all could believe and that you could believe that he was the Messiah." The end. Roll credits. And then all of a sudden we get this chapter, and it starts a little strange, right? Jesus also revealed himself, and he did it in this way. And then it tells the story. So they think it's added. But you know, whether it was added or whether it was original, I don't care. I am just really glad it's here. Because once you line it up with that story of Luke and you realize that this is not just a call, but this is a recall. Jesus is calling the disciples again, and the reason why that's important to me is because Jesus calls and recalls us over and over and over. And the disciples probably could not have heard the call to go be Jesus for others until they were broken and have had tragedy. Not because tragedy is good, not because shame and guilt are all things that need to humble ourselves so we can better follow Jesus, none of that. But because, like Roger said when he said last week that only a wounded Christ can heal the world, we might find Jesus in our joy. We absolutely should. We should find Jesus in community, in love, in hugs. Those are all important. But the place where we realize how badly the world needs us to be Jesus is when we are in tragedy. Where Jesus, the wounded Christ, meets us there and calls us and recalls us out of our tragedy, not only to take the next step, but to forgive ourselves. To forgive ourselves not so that we can be healed, but so that we can heal others. Do you love me? Yes, Lord, you know everything. Of course I love you. Feed my sheep.